Good evening. As we were standing there and waiting for my cue to come up, we were talking about how to deal with this question of why suffering. And the answer to the question of why you suffer is possibly because you're single. Now, for those of you who have not experienced suffering, please get married. And then the both will come together and you'll find both the question and the answer. Now, having said that, let's pray. Father, we come to you in Jesus' name, and I just ask, Lord, the time we spend together would be a time of considering this question with honesty. We ask, Lord, that our reflection would be concerning the truth, and it would be done in a manner that blesses us in setting us free. For we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Actually, when I said, having said that, let us pray, I was saying that as a joke. But given that as such serious people that you are, you all bowed down, I was forced to go and pray. Why do we suffer? Why do we suffer? It's such a challenging question. And the one thing you will realize, if you are a person who's suffering, and if you're honest about it, no matter what someone says to you, you always look for more. And if you're not someone who's suffering, and you're talking about this whole idea of suffering as somebody else's experience, you actually come to the same position. No matter what you say, you want to say something else. So the one thing I can guarantee you at the end of this evening is this. No matter what I say to you, you will go back saying, I wish he had said something else. I wish he had said something more. That's the very nature of the question. But my hope for us is, as we continue reflecting on this theme, this thought, and as I bring this theme to bear for our reflection this evening, that you will not merely consider what is being said, but more importantly, you will consider who it is that I'm speaking to you about, in the light of which you will be able to reflect appropriately on what is being said. So let me set the stage for you by asking us to think about how is it possible for us to even raise the question? What's the nature of this question and the limitation of the answers that we face? How do you even raise this question? And I'll give you a background to this. I grew up in India, and I grew up with a bunch of friends, Hindus and Muslims, and the thing we loved doing most in life is play cricket. I don't know if you do that over here, but that's what we did. We played cricket all the time. And one of my friends, we used to, if you have any idea of what cricket is and how the game is played, you have basically two guys going out there and they do their thing, and one of them comes back and another fellow goes and joins them or whatever. So I used to be one of the first two guys to go out, and a good friend of mine, Ramesh, a lovely fellow, we go out together, and I've always heard Ramesh say this. It's a prayer which is said in Sanskrit. Now, I'm not going to recite that for you in Sanskrit, but I'll tell you what that means in translation. His prayer simply says, lead me from darkness to light, lead me from untruth to truth, lead me from death to life. And you really don't think of saying these things when you're going to play cricket. What is he talking about? Are we going to get killed or something over here? It's not a battle of sorts. But there was never a single game that I've played with Ramesh in which Ramesh has not said this. And I've heard this repeatedly, years on end. We played together for quite a few years. And one day I asked Ramesh this question. Ramesh, I've seen you grow up and you are a very devout Hindu. But here's my question to you, Ramesh. When you say, lead me, and as a Hindu, you believe that everything is a God and everyone is a God, who is leading? And who is following? Now that's where I want to begin. I want to begin with us seriously considering why it is possible to even ask the question of why suffering. Because you see, the nature of this question brings to bear serious limitations with the answer. And that's the first thing I want you to think about this evening. The very nature of this question and the limitations of its answer. You see, one of the things that the atheist loves to do is to take the question of suffering, put it in front of the believer in God and says to him, well, if there's a God, what explains suffering? You see, because there's suffering, it proves there is no God. And he goes on and on and on. I'll come back to this later. But I want you to listen very carefully to this. Who's an atheist? An atheist is someone who believes there is no God. Now, if he believes there is no God, who is he asking the question to? You want to know why you're suffering. You do not believe that God exists. So who are you asking the question to? There's a serious limitation out there. Because for an atheist, there is no one to ask the question to. For my friend like Ramesh, for people like Ramesh, he has the same problem only from the opposite end. Because he believes that everything is God. So if my atheist friends have a problem in that there is no one to ask the question to, my pantheist friends have the same problem from the opposite end. They have no question to ask. What are you talking about when you say suffering? Do you see the problem? Now, I'm not suggesting to you that if you are an atheist, you do not experience the problem of pain. Or if you were a pantheist, a Hindu, that you don't long to find an answer. That's not my point. My point is, even in raising the question, you have a certain view of the answerer. And that's the first place I want us to consider, the limitation that this question places. And I've got a lot of friends who are what I call determinists. My Muslim friends are a classic example of that. I spend a lot of time working and living in the Middle East, and whenever we have a conversation, and if they want to say no to you, and if they want to be polite, here's what they will say, Inshallah, which literally means God willing, but metaphorically it means it's not going to happen. And I realize that very quickly when I'm having my conversations concerning a business contract, and when my client says to me, Inshallah, it means time for me to get up and leave. I'm not getting this business. But Islam is a view of God which says God is above good and evil, which means He is neither good nor evil. He is the author of all things, good and evil. Hear me carefully now. The last thing you want to do when you are in deep pain is to go and talk to the one who has caused you that pain. You see where this is going? If you were an atheist, there is no one to raise the question to. If you are a pantheist, there is no question for you to even ask. And if you were a monotheist like a Muslim, there is no point in asking the question. Life becomes unlivable, my dear beloved, when you are going through pain and you cannot even ask the question. Which means here's what I'm suggesting to you. Even before you consider the answer, there's only one place where you can actually ask the question. You're assuming that there is a God. You're assuming that this God is real, and you're assuming that this God is interested in your life. In other words, you're assuming a God who loves you. And so that's where the challenge really begins. So I want us to spend some time in having considered the challenge that this question poses. See, everybody asks this question. This is the thorniest question that people struggle with. I'm not surprised that in your bucket list you have this question. But not everybody has a privilege of an honest answer to this question. So I want to take a closer look at what are we asking. I want us to take a closer look at the whole question of pain. I want us to think through the problem of pain. You see, it comes to us in two vantage points over here. One is what I call the intellectual problem of pain. If there is a good God, how can there be so much evil, pain, and suffering in the world? Because God, by definition, is supposed to be a God who's able to do stuff, correct? If God can do stuff, and He loves you, and He will do stuff, why is life a mess? That's an intellectual problem. But that's not really as challenging as what I call the therapeutic problem of pain. See, there are two things to this whole idea when you think about pain. One is the intellectual, the other is the personal. If there is a God who really loves me and cares for me, the question is, why am I going through this pain? And for many, that's a far more challenging place to be than the theory of if there is a God, why is there pain in the world? Why do we suffer? You see, every time you ask the question of suffering, you do it from one of two vantage points. It's what I call asking the question from an armchair or asking the question from a wheelchair. The armchair is the intellectual question. You just happily sit back, you kind of have maybe your coconut latte. Newsflash, I just saw one person have it and I didn't like what I saw. I don't know what it tasted like, but just out there for you in case you want to go and experience suffering for yourself. You might want to try that. But there's this kind of thing where you sit back and you say, well, let's just talk about suffering. You know, well, if really there was a God, there wouldn't be this kind of a suffering, would there? And that's what I call an armchair questionnaire. You're happily sitting there and you're saying, this doesn't just fit out there. And there are kind of people who raise a question from what I call the wheelchair, where they are the ones who are broken, they are crushed. They are the ones who are experiencing this pain. And they are saying, why am I suffering? I had this experience of both being an armchair questioner and a wheelchair questioner back to back in a space of 24 hours. I was studying in Singapore Bible College. This was 9 years ago. And my wife was back in India, pregnant with what could have been our second child. Now, at that particular time in my studies, I was doing the doctrine of God, and more specifically, my presentation was on the sovereignty of God. And here I am. I'm standing in front of my class, my professors are all there in tow, and I'm waxing eloquent on the sovereignty of God. And one of my classmates stands up and says to me, you see, in the light of all that is falling apart in the world, is it really possible to have such a high view of the sovereignty of God? And then I went on to respond to that question. I told him how that no matter what, God works all things together for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. And I went on and on and on. 45 minutes later, everybody stands up and applauds. 50 minutes later, I'm on the phone with my sister-in-law. And she's on the other end of the phone saying to me, Jose, I'm sorry, we might lose the baby. What do I do? And I still remember this. I took the only possible flight out, and I'm flying from Singapore to Bangalore. And on the flight there, every single argument I had presented for the case that God is sovereign kept playing back in my mind. And I can tell you this in all honesty, I don't think there would have been anyone better than me in that place to show me that God is sovereign. But I can also tell you this. It was the most useless conversation I've ever had with myself. I knew every argument in the book, but when I went from an armchair questioner to a wheelchair questioner, it was no longer the arguments that I was looking for. The arguments didn't change, but the intensity with which I raised the question changed. I was not looking for an answer. I was looking for an answerer. I was not looking for information. I was looking for a hand to hold. We touched down. I got out of the aircraft, picked up my phone. The first message, "Sorry, Jose, we've lost the baby." What do you do? What do you do when all that you knew to be right, all that you knew to be perfect, and all that you knew was sufficient suddenly becomes bankrupt? See, when you look at the problem of pain, that's the thorny issue. The thorny issue is, how do we navigate with the hiddenness of God? That's the third thing I want you to think about. How do you navigate through life with the hiddenness of God? You see, let me read this for you. Bart Ehrman was a New Testament scholar. He continues to remain one of the most noted liberal New Testament scholars. He is one of those New Testament scholars who does not believe in the fact that the Bible is inspired or Jesus is the Son of God. Here is what Bart Ehrman writes and tells us as to why he is where he is today. The story is that Bart Ehrman was invited by his sister and brother-in-law to go to a church service. This was the Advent service. So he goes there. He is in the pews, sitting there, enjoying the choir and the music. And they sing of God becoming man. And he says, "I was sitting there and weeping." But here's the conclusion he comes to. He writes, "If God had come into the darkness with the advent of the Christ child bringing salvation to the world, why is the world in such a state? Why doesn't he enter into the darkness again? Where is the presence of God in a world of pain and misery? Why is the darkness so overwhelming?" And he goes on and on and on. And then he asks, where is God now? If he came into the darkness, please note, here's his question, and made a difference then, why is there still no difference? You asked that question before? If he came into the darkness, and he made a difference then, why is there no difference now? You see, as you look at this question, as you look at the limitation that the question places on the one you're asking the question to, you look at how thorny this question is, in that you can have all the right answers and yet feel completely hopeless at the end of it. And you come to this hinge, as it were, and ask the question, where are you, God, when it hurts? And that's where I want to begin, to help us navigate through this maze, to look at the hiddenness of God. But Ehrman is not alone. I want you to listen to someone who centuries before Bart Ehrman said the same thing, albeit with a very different disposition. David, when he is pouring his heart out to God, we see this in Psalm 27. Actually, if you read Psalm 27, it appears to be that it's like two different people writing. On one side, he says, "The Lord is my light and my salvation, of whom shall I be afraid? The Lord is my rock, of whom shall I be terrified?" Though an army rises up against me, though my enemies encompass against me, I will not be afraid. Oh, one thing I have asked, that I will seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life and inquire of him in his temple. This man was loving being with God. And then as you continue reading, here's what he says. Hear, O Lord, when I cry with my voice. Have mercy upon me. Answer me. You said, seek my face. My heart said to you, your face, O Lord, I seek. Do not hide your face from me. Do not turn your servant away in anger. Lord, you have been my help. Do not leave me. Do not forsake me. Do you hear what he's saying? He's not only saying, God, the information I have of you is of no value. He's saying to God, God, the experience I've had of you till yesterday is not helping me today. Where are you? Where are you when it hurts? So for Bart Ehrman to raise a question saying, if the Christ child came into the Advent to make the darkness go away, why is there still so much darkness? Well, he's not asking anything new. And neither will you or I be asking something new when we cry out and say to God, God, where are you? When my heart is being crushed, when my life is falling apart, where are you? C.S. Lewis says this. He says, if God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were almighty, he would be able to do what he wished. But the creatures are not happy. Therefore, God lacks either the goodness or the power or both. This is the problem of suffering, he says, in its simplest form. Where are you, God? If you really love me, if you are a God of love, why this mess? Why am I in this mess? The God of the Bible, hear me carefully, is a hidden God. Oh, he's not an absentee God. He's not a God who's gone missing. But he is a hidden God. Because when he speaks through the prophet Jeremiah, he makes a very simple assertion. He says, when you seek for me, you will find me, and you seek for me with all your heart. You see, if God is truly almighty, and if he decides to impose himself on you and I, would we have the privilege to turn our backs to him and say no? It would keep us from being the very people he has created us to be. Creatures who love him and live in a loving relationship with him. So yes, the God of the Bible is a hidden God. And we need to understand how to grapple with the hiddenness of God. And so may I suggest to you the first thing we do as we come to this, and the fourth thing that I'm saying to you over here is that suffering, evil, has two faces. There are two faces to evil. Physical. You go through pain. You go through suffering, you meet an accident, somebody breaks your heart. There is this whole thing called the physical aspect of evil and suffering. That's one face. But there's a much darker and much more devious face of pain and suffering, and that is moral. The moral face of evil. And may I suggest to you that the moral face of evil is far worse than the physical face of evil. Supposing we were walking together and you tripped and you fell and you hurt yourself, would you hurt? Would you be in pain? Would you suffer? All right. Now let's say, supposing that whole scene was captured on tape. And two things happen because of that. We play it out for everyone to see. And as we play it out, you notice that I intentionally tripped you and you fell. And that was so that we could all watch you and laugh. Now, which would hurt you more? Was it the physical fact of falling down and hurting and bruising your knees? Or was it that someone had played a cruel joke on you? Was it the physical infliction of pain or the moral violation of who you are? Which causes you greater pain? Moral evil is a far worse off source of pain than physical evil. That's the first thing you need to recognize if you want to come to grips with how to answer this question of where are you, God, when I suffer, and how do I live my life in the light of suffering. You see, sin is a far greater problem than pain and suffering is. Pain is a parasite on sin. As long as your life is a life that reflects sin and the problem of sin, pain will be around. Suffering is not something you can do away with. You can never deal with a problem by treating its symptoms. Are you in pain? You can never deal with a problem by treating its symptoms. Pain is symptomatic of something that has gone wrong, very wrong, deep within. And so when we ask the question of where are you, God, when it hurts, we now begin to see what God is actually doing with our pain. You know, the Bible reminds us of this very, very simply, that I'm intrigued by this, that if you look at the Bible does not tell you how to avoid pain. It doesn't. I mean, if the Bible was about helping us live, happy lives, maybe happy clappy, if that's your inclination, if that's what the Bible is supposed to be, then why doesn't it give us 5 steps to avoid pain in your life? Maybe some of us have a problem with 5. Okay, let's have 3. Why doesn't it do that? Instead, it keeps constantly reminding us of learning how to suffer well. I find it rather intriguing that James would write to the church and he says, "Count it joy, my brothers and sisters, when you go through trials of various kinds." The first question I'm going to ask James when I meet him is, please explain what suffering you were going through when you wrote this. Really? Who in his right mind would write to suggest to you that what you're going through is of great joy? But therein lies a problem that we need to set right in our understanding. You see, difficulty does not mean undesirable. Talk to any mother who's given birth to a child without taking the epidural or having a C-section. They will tell you it's the most painful experience. Don't ask me, don't look at me, I failed the test. I didn't even apply for it. But you talk to a mother who's gone through labor, and she will tell you it's the most difficult thing physically. It drains her. But you ask her this, because it is so difficult, does that make your child undesirable? Make sure you have a safe distance between her and yourself when you ask that question. We do this all the time. In fact, the more desirable something is, the more we are prepared to endure what it is that we are going through. Difficulty does not mean undesirable. And so when James is telling us to count it pure joy when we go through trials of various kinds, he's saying to us, look at what you are becoming, and that would give you the perspective to deal with what you're going through. Because suffering produces patience, perseverance, character. Character gives hope, and hope does not disappoint. You become a person who is filled with hope. So when you come to this whole issue of grappling with the questioner, your heart and mine, and how do we deal with this? I want to suggest to you this, that when we go through physical pain, our physical pain is a pointer to a spiritual reality. Fix that, your pain will take care of itself. Look at Socrates, and he says this: bad things never happen to good people. Right? Socrates is saying this. Bad things never happen to good people. The only thing good about us as a person is a soul. The soul is good. Only you can make bad things happen to the soul. Don't mind your body. That's Socrates' version. So if you go to Socrates and he says, Socrates, I'm in pain, help me. He says, don't worry. That's okay. It's just your body. Ignore it. You go to another philosopher, another religious leader, Siddhartha Gautama. Now he gives you the Four Noble Truths, and he says to you, he gets the first one right. And at this point, both he and James are in agreement. What causes strife and quarrel amongst you? James asks in James chapter 4. And he goes on to say, isn't it the desire that overwhelms within you? You ask and you do not have, because you ask among selfish ambition, so that you could exploit others and please yourself. Now Gautama says this: suffering is caused by desire. That's the first of the Four Noble Truths. Suffering is caused by desire. But look at what he says with that. You have to learn to relinquish your desires. And you can relinquish your desires if you leave your desires behind and go and follow the eightfold path. So if you went to Socrates and said, Socrates, I'm in deep pain, I'm suffering, what do I do with it? His answer to you will be, well, dump your body, don't care about it. If you go to Siddhartha Gautama and you said to him, Siddhartha Gautama, I'm in deep pain, what do I do with it? He would say to you, it is because of your desires. Get rid of our desires. The way you get rid of your desires is that you would get yourself away from every relationship that is dear to you. Leave and go. Be detached from everything. Neither of which are helpful. And here's why. No matter how much of ink philosophy has spilt, it's still not answered the question of how do we help someone who's in pain. In fact, the last thing you want to do when you're in pain is go speak to a philosopher. If you have not experienced it thus far, it will become much more clearer and larger than life after you have that conversation. But you see, Buddhism, and I don't mean to be critical over here, I'm trying to be earnest in what I'm asking us to consider over here. Buddhism was born raising the question of why we suffer. Centuries later, has Buddhism given us an answer? It still remains a religion-sized question about suffering, not an answer. The question still remains. Where then are we going to find help? How then are we going to live in a world that is seethed with pain? Who will help us here? Remember the first things that we spoke about in terms of the challenge of the question that it places on us. That if you were an atheist, there is no one to ask the question to. If you're a pantheist, there is no question to ask. If you're a theist who believe that God has prefixed everything and you are just living your life at His whim, there is no point in asking the question. You see how deep this question is. It affects you to the very core of your being. And you see that the physical pain and suffering you endure is the consequences of something that's happened even more deeper in your very being. It's your sin that's caused you to deal with this. Who will help us? You see, when you look at the scriptures, you begin to see that it gives you a truthful answer in the person of Jesus Christ. The scripture gives us a truthful answer in the person of Jesus Christ as we engage with this issue and attempt to answer the questioner. See, Jesus does something fascinating about sin and suffering. We often ask the question, why do the innocents suffer? Have you been asked that question? Why do the innocents suffer? What's fascinating about the Bible is that the answer to the question of suffering and the question of justice, why innocents suffer, comes to us at the most unjust act in history. And you will see this. You read through the Gospels or you read through history and you look at the person of Jesus. The commentary that is made of Him is that He did not deserve what was given to Him. The cross is the most unjust act ever committed. In fact, Irving Linton, a crime trial lawyer, he does this in his book called The Sanhedrin Verdict. He surveyed a host of criminal proceedings and trials, and he says this, as a criminal lawyer, as a trial lawyer, I've come to this conclusion that there is no other sentence meted out, capital punishment, meted out to a human being as the sentence of Jesus. Unique is the judgment passed on Jesus, he says, in which the accused is condemned not for what he did, but for who he said he is. Unique among the criminal proceedings of the world is this concerning Jesus, that He was killed, given the capital punishment, not for what He did, but for who He said He is. Now think about this. I mean, if I came up here and said, I am the Son of God, you kind people in Manila would send me to a kind place. You might call it a mental asylum. That's out of your kindness. You would do that. But would you kill me for that? The worst act of injustice is where we begin to see justice meted out for you and me. So here's what I want you to think about very carefully as I pave this path of going from the complexity of the question to the simplicity of the answer. Yes, this is a thorny question. Yes, this is a question that really cuts to the very core of our being, whether we experience it or we go through with someone else who is experiencing this. I just got a message from a friend of mine back in Singapore, and he said this to me. His mother has been the caregiver of his aunt who has been suffering with cancer for 5 years. And she's seen the pain of her sister 5 years. And today, she is diagnosed with cancer herself. My friend is asking me this question: how long? How long? Is there an end at sight? Is pain our lot, or is there hope? Are we just misguided fools to believe that this is possible? Somehow this will all work out together, or are we people of hope? You know, I was speaking to a group of young kids, 14 to 16-year-old, and a 14-year-old came up to me and he asked me this question: I think even he was shocked at the pointedness of the question. He looked at me in the eye when I finished speaking, and he said to me, "Tell me this, why should I not commit suicide?" 14-year-old. Why should I not commit suicide? I mean, all of us were shocked by the question, and it was quite interesting to see that everybody standing around me left, and we were just standing. And I'm trying to talk with him. And I said to him, "Do you mind explaining where you came with when you raised that question?" He said, "No, if you have an answer, give it to me. If not, it's fine." So I said to him, "You should go ahead and commit suicide if you don't have hope." The only thing that gives a human being the courage to live in the space of this pain and suffering, when we go through this and we endure this, is hope. And for hope, not something that we make up. Hope that's real. Hope is not wishful thinking. No, that's not what hope is. Hope is awaiting what is real because you trust someone who will get you there. There is no point in living if you do not have hope. Psychologists will tell you the thing that keeps people who are desperate from taking their lives is hope. When you're grappling with despair in life and you lose hope, you do not want to live any longer. Where is God in all of this? You begin to see that He steps into our brokenness by receiving that brokenness upon Himself unjustly. I've often told my friends this when they ask the question, what is God up to when the innocent suffer? I say to them, I know of only one person who is innocent and who suffered, and he did it on his own free will. Why do we have hope? We have hope because we are not merely looking at an answer, we are speaking with the answerer. Only in the Christian faith do you have that, my dear beloved. In Hinduism, it is duty. Do your duty. And as you do your duty, it will be fated to you. It's your dharma and your karma. In Buddhism, it is your nirvana. In Confucianism, it is your pledge of allegiance. In Taoism, it is the way of the Tao as it is with Shintoism. And you go down the line, every answer to the question of suffering says to you, fix your problem. Fix your problem. I was sharing earlier this evening with a group. I just gave them the answer, but let me give you the story. A few years ago, I was in Hanoi, having this meeting with a friend of mine. She's a Buddhist. I got to know her. She's a really intelligent person. She's done a PhD and then some postdoctoral studies in prawns and stuff like that. So we got really chatting about this. And over dinner, I asked her, I said, Thien, why is it that you do not believe in Jesus? And her answer to me is very simple. She says, Jose, that is not fair. How can I expect someone else to pay for my problems? It is not fair. She had a deep sense of justice. He said, it is unfair for me to even expect it from him, let alone accept it from him. And the conversation went on. We finished dinner. There were many things that were said, but nothing was connecting. And after we finished dinner, I had this toothpick in my hand, and I was playing with it. The toothpick broke in my hand. So I left the toothpick on the table, and I said to Thien, can you do me a favor? Can you please wish the toothpick to fix itself? but don't touch it. Is the toothpick broken? Yes, it is. Can you please help the toothpick fix itself, but don't touch it? And she looked at me and she said, brokenness cannot fix itself. Your pain, your suffering, my pain, and my suffering is what we have brought upon ourselves because there's something deep within us that's broken. And you and I have no power to fix it. As hard as you may try, as hard as you may try to ignore it, avoid it, be entertained by other things to avoid it, as hard as you may try, let me tell you this, brokenness cannot fix itself. The only thing that brokenness can do to itself is to be broken further. It takes someone who is whole and who's willing to help to fix. And that's what Jesus did. He did that by stepping into our brokenness, not by instructing it to fix it ourselves. You see, the most unreasonable thing that someone can do when you are broken is to give you an instruction of why you should not have been broken in the first place. But you see, that's what everybody around you is saying to you. The one thing Jesus does not do to you is to patronize you. He recognizes we are broken. And in that single act where it has been the most unjust act ever meted out, He steps into your space, into your life and mine. Not only does He step into your life and mine, He takes your brokenness and mine upon Himself so that He could be the one who would fix it. And when you come to Jesus, what you're actually doing is that you are coming to a physician, not a pharmacist. You are not going to the pharmacist and saying, I think I have a headache. Do you have a Panadol for me? That's like the marketplace of world religions. You think you know what your problem is, and you think you know what the solution to your problem is. So you just go to the dispensary and you pick up your medication. Try going to a physician and doing the same. Well, if he gives you medication without first checking you out, he should lose his license. But what does a physician do? He examines you. He helps you understand why you are in the pain you are in, and then he treats you. So when you follow the physician's instructions, you are finding a way out of what is now causing you the pain. Deal with sin, and suffering will take care of itself. You stay obsessed with suffering, you will only sink deeper in pain. Where is God when I suffer? Right there with you, helping you through it, so you will be a person who is whole. And that's why we are told, celebrate your suffering, because you are in the hands of the great physician. Let Him have His work in your life, and you will be free from pain for all eternity. Thank you so much. You've been patient in listening. God bless you. There is a time for us to raise questions, so I want to leave this time open for you to raise questions that you have. I know I've given you a broad sweep of the whole subject, so I want you to ask the questions that you have, and we'll spend about 20 minutes or so doing that. So I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to think through your questions. There are microphones out there. raise your hand and you would have something passed on to you.
Yes. I actually have
Yes.
a question that you mentioned something before about karma.
About?
Karma.
All right.
If I'm not mistaken, that was from what particular religion? And
Hinduism.
Who did Hinduism?
Hinduism.
Hinduism. Okay. For some strange reason, based on observation, I've seen it all over Facebook, and I've seen it in everyday social life that, you'll have this bad karma because of a bad relationship or something you did in the past. It's karma. Oh, that person experienced suffering and pain because it's his karma or whatever because of whatever thing he did in the past. But would it be safe to say, to raise the argument, because I had this interesting conversation on Facebook, and I said, how is karma validated when it contradicts everything that Jesus did and who he is? Would that be safe to say? And how can I justify that karma has no biblical right or foundation or principle? How can I back that up into say that karma does not exist based on the gospel of Jesus?
Well, karma is not something that, if I hear you correct, you're asking the question, how can someone who accepts the Christian worldview also subscribe to karma? Yeah, and I don't think it's possible for you to accept the Christian worldview and subscribe to karma. Karma is not cause and effect alone. Karma is much more than simple cause and effect. In other words, if you trip and fall and you hurt yourself, that's cause and effect. You did not trip and fall because of bad karma. That's the point. So I don't think it's sustainable from within a Christian worldview to justify karma. It's quite possible, and I don't know about you, but I don't take Facebook conversations too seriously. I have a face and a book, and I kind of keep them separate. So that's as far as I go. But jokes aside, it is very difficult to sustain a karmic disposition towards life from within a Christian worldview. And if there's anything you would see in Jesus, you would see that he vindicates himself before all. He is the only one in all of the world religious leaders who says, "Of what sin would you accuse me?" Skeptic and seeker alike remain silent. Even at his trial, what was said of him is that I don't see anything worthy of him being condemned. He was acquitted as innocent and punished as guilty. So the karmic framework doesn't quite fit within a Judeo-Christian worldview, and I think if it's a light conversation, you let it pass. But if it's something that's deep-rooted, and if that is the justification, if you have the privilege to call up that person and speak to them, then do that. That would be what I would say. But they don't fit well in terms of worldviews. Yeah? Thank you.
For those who have questions, to make it easier and to get the handle of how many people are going to ask questions, can we just form a line here, if that's okay?
Hello, good afternoon.
Yes.
Sir, Jose, good evening.
Good evening.
I'll just check my phone. I just typed my question. Sorry.
That'll help me if you speak into the microphone.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
My question is, actually I have two questions, but I will only ask one.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. A while ago, you talked about the hidden God. The God of the Bible is a hidden God. Actually, my question is, why and how is the God of the Bible a hidden God? I know asking that question is like knowing how God thinks. So I rephrase it and make it more convenient for us. Why did he need to hide? Or maybe we only perceive that he is a hidden God. So why do you or do we perceive God as a hidden God? Thank you.
Excellent question. Thank you for asking that. What's your name?
Kenneth. Ken.
Ken.
Yes.
All right, Ken. Thank you for asking that question. When we speak of the God as a hidden God in the scriptures, here's what we are saying. The God of the Bible is not an overbearing God. He does not overwhelm you with his presence. Which is why I qualified it and I said, he is a hidden God, but not an absentee God. He loves you to grapple with what you are going through honestly. You see, Job, if you read through Job, and for those of you who have not read through Job, I would encourage you to do it in one sitting. It is a powerful book to read, but you have to do it cover to cover, so to speak, in one sitting. If that's possible, do it. Here's what you would see Job come to. Job comes to God with a high view of God and morality, and he says to God, I have lived an upright life. In fact, that was God's testimony concerning Job. And so he looks at his wife and he says to his wife, naked I come, naked I go. God gives, he takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In other words, God is free to do whatever he wants to. That's how he begins his journey in the story. And as you see that story unfold with his friends come into play and the conversations, they kept getting intense and even deep to the point that Job's wife is sitting there and saying to him, curse God and die, Job. And he starts chewing on this and he says, I wish I was never born. And then he has a whole series of questions to ask God, and it's almost presented in a foil of a passive sense. He said, if I could ask God questions, this is what I would ask God. And he's raising questions concerning where God is. And then, when God finally appears on the scene, as it were, having this conversation with Job, he begins by not saying to Job, Job, I'm so sorry, Job. Satan is the one who put us up to all of this. I simply asked him a question. Have you considered Job? I was so proud of you, and look what he did. I'm so sorry, Job. That's not how God deals with it. God looks at Job and says, all right, you have questions. Let me ask you some. Where were you when all of this began? You surely seem to know a lot. You seem to have a much broader perspective of life. You seem to know the end from the beginning. Why didn't you answer my questions? And question after question after question, 40 questions God brings and levels before Job. And now you know what Job says? I've heard of you in the hearing of my ear. Now I see you. What made the difference? It was not information, but it was God becoming larger to life in Job's life by his hiddenness. The more you grapple with the reality of God, not because God imposes himself on you, but as he would speak to the prophet Jeremiah, because you seek for him with all your heart, you begin to grapple with God for who he really is. You begin to appreciate that he is sovereign and you are responsible. That sin is not merely what you do, sin is what you have become. And you see that you need a Savior more than anything else. And so I say to you, the hiddenness of God is to our advantage for us to grapple with God truthfully, not merely for the sake of a benefit. The only religion in the world in which you and God have a relationship is the Christian faith. Every other faith, worship is a transaction. And the only thing that guards you from making your worship of the true living God and keeps you from making it a transaction is when God allows you the privilege to seek after him with all your heart. The hiddenness of God is a treasure. Seek it out and you will do well. I hope that helps you.
We have time for 2 more questions. And the next 2 questioners will get free entrance tomorrow at the conference.
There's a questioner at the back. No? No? Yeah? All right. Yeah. Go ahead. Yes.
Okay, good evening.
Good evening.
Thanks very much for that intellectual discussion. And I think it's a very, very good light on this particular paradox of suffering. But you mentioned a while ago that God is there with you. Actually, in the latter parts, you said that God is with you there while you're suffering. And you actually challenged the Buddhist faith for not actually offering this answer to that question. So I have 3 follow-up questions.
Sure. 3,
under
okay.
that.
So he gets 3 passes, is it? I'm just kidding. Sorry, go ahead.
The first one, how is this exactly answered by Christianity? Number 2, you said that God is with you, so how would you know that He is there with you? And thirdly, assuming you think He is helping you, how would you know this is not just a conjecture or an invention of the rational mind? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for those 3 questions. I think they are brilliantly woven together. God's presence is real. How do I know it is He who is helping me and that it is not a figment of my imagination, and that contrasted with the other worldviews, right? The first thing I would say to you is incarnation. There is no other worldview which speaks of God dwelling with man as God in the flesh. The doctrine of incarnation is not new or unique to the Christian faith. Hinduism has got plenty. In fact, you've had 9 incarnations in Hinduism, and they're waiting for the 10th and the most perfect one. You can go into any pantheistic system and you find incarnation wrapped all around it. So there's nothing new about incarnation, but here's where the difference is. In Hinduism, God can become an eagle or a tortoise or a half lion, half man, because God is so completely disconnected from the human, He can be anything. But according to the Christian faith, the only thing that God can become in His engagement with man is a human being, because God created man in His image. So God was becoming the most godlike of creatures in the incarnation. And we see this told to us in the scriptures. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. In other words, God's truthful presence was with you and with me, and we beheld His glory, the glory of the one and only. See, Jesus did nothing wrong. You cannot really say that of any other worldview. You cannot. I'll give you a contrast. Supposing I said to you, you know what, I've got this brilliant idea, this incredible burden on my heart, and I'm going to abandon my family to pursue that. What would you say if I asked you, is that a right or a wrong thing to do? What would you say? Would that be a right thing for me to do or a wrong thing for me to do? To abandon my responsibility towards my family just because I've got a burden for me to fulfill. And you begin to see that what we call as religious leaders, they have their shortcomings. They have their frailty. They have their falling. And they would be the first to acknowledge it themselves. Jesus is the only one who challenged and who was acknowledged as sinless. In fact, He's the only one who raised that question of you and I. Which one of you finds me guilty of any charge? When we say the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, here's how we know it is true. He lived His life in the public space. That's how we know it is true. the ones closest to him were the ones who actually attested to his integrity. Everything we know of Jesus comes from an eyewitness testimony. You can't quite say the same of anybody else. Now, what is the most fascinating thing about this is Jesus did not step into that space accidentally. Every other world religion leader stepped into that space accidentally. You can take your pick. It's always been that way. Jesus is the only one who said, "For this reason I have come." You will not find that statement on anybody else's lips. So he knew who he was. He stepped into your space and mine intentionally, and he did the one thing that he alone could. Which is why Paul, writing decades later, would say this to the Corinthian church: God made him who knew no sin to be sin, so that we could be the righteousness of God. To put it in context, God made him who was perfect to be crushed and broken. That's Isaiah's language, so that we who are crushed and broken could be perfect. Now you find me another parallel to even compare, and then we can talk in terms of why the rest could be even considered. That's just step one. That's how we know. How do we know that he's done this and we are not conjuring this up? There's nothing mystical about what Jesus has offered. Everything was validated in physical time-space. And I'm speaking specifically of the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus could have very well said, "You crucify me, I will die, and then 3 days later I will rise spiritually." That would be an Indian guru speaking, and it would fit very well. He didn't say that. He said, "I will die, and 3 days later I would rise physically." It is the physical resurrection of Jesus from the dead, which is why you and I have hope of eternity and a release from the dead. So that's not conjuring things up. That's not making things up. That is living within the reality of what we have played out in history. Now, the third question that you asked, how do you know this is applicable to me? Here's how I know it's applicable to me. Because he says to me that you don't deserve it, but I love you. That's why the cross is at the core and the center of the answer to any and all of human predicament. But I thank you for raising that question. Do we have one last question? All right, we've got time for one last question.
Hello. Hi.
Kai.
Sir Joes, our God is a good and loving God. Therefore, evil cannot and does not come from him. And a lot of people would argue that evil comes from man, who ended up sinning because of the free will that was given by God to man, because of the rational nature that we need in order for us to love, because love is a choice more than a feeling. However, it doesn't quite suffice the problem, because if evil came from man, why was there a serpent in the garden of
Eden? Okay.
Do you get my question? Wait lang.
Yeah,
I'm trying to phrase it well.
That's okay. Yeah, we're talking about the one in Eden, yes, not the one in Jordan.
Yeah.
Well, the serpent was a
Eden.
prop. Let's put it this way. It didn't look very nice for a tree to be there without a serpent, so the serpent was just hanging out there for special effects. No. I was kidding. Thank you for asking that question. Here's what I will say that we think through. When we say that God is not the author of evil, and we say that evil comes from within the choices we make as a consequence of those choices, we go so far and we say that that's because God's created us in love. And he's created us for love, and that's fine. But we still have not answered the question, what is evil? And when we begin to answer that question, you will see how this fits together. You see, evil is not the presence of something.
It's the absence of God.
It's the absence of something. Say, for example, I wanted darkness in this room. What were you going to do? Are you going to look for a switch called darkness and switch it on? What would you do?
Switch off the light.
You would switch off the light. So darkness is the absence of light. Evil is the absence of good. In other words, evil is a parasite on good. If there were no good, there can be no evil. Does this make sense? So what you see happening in the garden is a narrative that tells us how that choice was played out. Everything in the garden was good for food and pleasing to the eye. That's what you see in Genesis chapter 2, verse 6. And following through into 9. That's the Genesis 2. But now in Genesis 3, you have this serpent offering a question. Did God say you cannot eat of all the trees of the garden? That conversation goes on, and there's a proposition being presented. Maybe it's because God does not want you to be wise. And here's what the story tells us, that serpent prompted Eve, and she looked at the fruit in the garden in a certain way. She said, and looking at the tree in the middle of the garden, the fruit was good for food, pleasing to the eye, and desirable to make one wise. Well, every tree in the garden was good for food and pleasing to the eye. The difference this was for her desirable to make her wise. And the Hebrew in that place is a word called sakal, which means autonomy. Now, you don't need to know the Hebrew to do that, because you look at it. Who is it that proclaims things as good up to this point in Genesis? Who declares things as good? It's God. He says, let's make this, and he finishes making it, and he says it's good. Let's make that, he finished making that, and it's good. In fact, he's also the one who says that it is not good. He looks at man, singles, please hear this. He looks at man and says, it's not good for man to be alone. You get the drift, right? So the judge of what is good and what's not good is God. And now suddenly Eve is deciding to exercise her choice, in which she decides, autonomous of God, what is good and what is not. The absence of the judgment of God and the privilege of living in the light of that judgment of what is good places the responsibility of you deciding what good is. And you and I are not big enough to do this. We will end up with evil. Which is why I said the serpent was a foil. The question is, would you have done better if you were Eve and there was no serpent? Would you?
I hope so.
I hope so too. Thank you so much. You've been kind and patient. God bless you.